thank you so much. And hold on, just rewind here. I've got a preview of coming attractions. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Ellen, for the kind introduction. Thank you so much, Yumi, for organizing this series. Thank you to the Arts and Ideas series as a whole. Thank you to the people who make this event possible, including but not limited to the IT staff, the film crew, the people who maintain the building, the university as a whole, and all of you, thank you very much for being here. With an extra special cherry on top bonus, thank you for wearing masks at this, our first in-person event, which at least for me personally makes the difference between my being able to be here or not. I'm so excited to get to talk to you about my brand spanking new book. Do please come in. We haven't really started yet, I'm just talking. I believe there's a sign-in if anybody hasn't signed in yet, maybe do that on the way out because we like to get a head count. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about my brand spanking new book. It came out on March 16th. So it is only very recently hot off the presses. Here it is. I have a few copies available for sale if anyone actually wants one. Cam has volunteered to help me sell them if necessary. I say if necessary because I should warn you that I'm selling them at my author discount price. I can buy them direct from the press. Without any markup to cover the cost of mailings, at my discount, they're $54 each. So I will still love you if you don't buy a book. But there they are available, so you can like look at them and, I don't know, poke them or something. I'd like to point out also the beautiful skunks on the cover. When I'm in a good mood, this skunk is named Marion and this one is named Elizabeth. When I'm in a bad one, this skunk is named Tom and this one is named Ezra, after various modern poets. All right, so I think it's sort of a tradition in these talks, at least among my colleagues in the English department, to say a few words about how the process of the book started. Most of my time I'm going to spend talking about the actual content, but the origin story of this book is very brief, and it's sort of perversely rooted in the first book that I wrote, my book on Nabokov and Salman Rushdie. When I was finishing that manuscript, I still work on both of those writers, I still love them, I'm going to a Nabokov conference this summer, but at the moment that I was finishing that manuscript, I never wanted to see either one of them again. I was really over those two writers. And I was trying to look ahead to my next project, and what I really wanted was to have a project where, when I was done with it, I wasn't going to be ready to wash my hands of the people I was writing about. I wanted, and this is really the way I thought of it, to be writing about people I would still be friends with at the end of the project. By which I don't necessarily mean that I've been hanging out with Marianne Moore since she's been dead for a few decades, although some of the poets in the final chapter I do have the good fortune to know personally. So I started reading work by Auden, who's sort of cheating to have in this book titled American Poetry because he was born in Britain and was living in Britain for most of the period that I actually talk about in this text, but he becomes an American citizen eventually, and since it's all about redefining the boundaries of community, I thought I'd model that. And so I started that summer that I was sort of putting the finishing touches on the old book, on the book I was finishing. I also started just reading around in Auden's work kind of adventurously, just trying to figure out what the big holes were in my knowledge of his oeuvre and filling in some of those holes. And what I found myself increasingly struck by was how he used humor at moments that seemed not obviously funny. How maybe it was just my sense of humor, like identifying elements in his work, but maybe it was more. And out of that sort of sense of, oh, that's why I like this guy, because he's funny, and my own sort of personal and cultural commitment to humor as a mode of discourse and a mode of communication, which is very efficient and therefore aesthetically related to some of the work of humor, which can also be a very efficient mode of communication, I found myself asking more and more questions about how exactly humor works. And what I'm going to now move to talking about is a beginning or a partial version of some of my answers to that question. Well, how does humor work, and especially how does humor work when it works well and gets you somewhere new instead of just being a callback to something overly familiar? So here's a pretty picture of my brand new book with my pretty skunks, which I'm so fond of. And I want to open with a little discussion of theories of humor, because we don't actually entirely understand why people laugh. This is very much an active discussion in both philosophy and neurology. So one of the oldest versions of a theory of humor goes back to Aristotle and Plato, and it's this idea of superiority theory. Aristotle's description of clowns in the comedy is that clowns tend to be social and moral inferiors of the main characters, and we can laugh at them because we're better than they are. Thomas Hobbes, the Renaissance political philosopher, articulates this with the famous phrase, sudden glory. When you laugh, you are feeling the sudden glory of realizing that you are better than the person that you're laughing at. And of course, Hobbes uses this as an example of why people who are really important don't ever laugh, because they're secure enough that they don't need to take out their insecurities on these sort of hapless victims. Hobbes obviously was a kick at parties. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, late 19th, early 20th century, also gives us a version of superiority theory, arguing that we laugh at the near human. He has this example of, one of his big terms is mechanicalism. You laugh when someone's behaving in a mechanical manner which is inappropriate for their circumstance. Imagine if somebody's riding a bicycle down the road and then they fall over into a mud puddle, but they keep pedaling with their legs. That would be an example of Bergson's mechanicalism. But as you've probably gotten one step ahead of me here, this idea that you laugh at what's almost human, you laugh at what you're superior to, also is a very good description of some really horrible forms of humor. This is amenable to all kinds of well, if I say abuse, it's almost designed to describe forms of racist, homophobic, xenophobic, misogynistic, etc. humor, which, if that's all humor does, that's really depressing, and I don't want to do it anymore. The basic model here is Nelson on The Simpsons, who, whenever someone falls over and hurts themselves, goes, ha ha, like that. So that's obviously not a happy model of humor. So what are some others? Another major one, which I find really interesting, is Freud's model, and Freud has a whole lot on humor, and this is only one of Freud's theories, but useful for me to have it in everybody's ears, is relief theory, also called release theory, and is based on this sort of hydraulic model of how human minds and emotions work. The principle is that we laugh when the effort that we are expending turns out to be unnecessary. So, for example, we laugh when we don't have to exert energy to repress unacceptable ideas and emotions. This is a form of transgressive humor. So if I stand up here in my work clothes with my nice boots and I suddenly make a fart joke, I am empowering all of you to acknowledge that we live in human bodies with a digestive system, something which you're otherwise not supposed to admit. And yes, I have fart jokes in the index of my book. This is one of my proudest moments as a scholar. So I'm suddenly allowing us to laugh at that fact because you're not exerting energy to sort of forget that you live in a body. Similarly, when you no longer need to use energy to keep your emotions in order, when you suddenly can do something exaggerated or over the top, and I can windmill my arms like this, you can laugh because I'm not exerting energy to keep myself in order. And finally, and this is the one I find most interesting, when you no longer need to use energy to create meaning. So where does the meaning that you're getting from my speech come from? The basic linguistic philosophy, right? Language, the meaning of language is derived from consensus. It's not absolute, it's not baked in. You are putting in effort at all times to understand the words that someone is saying to you. So then when somebody makes a pun or speaks nonsense syllables, suddenly you don't need to expend that effort in order to try to actually understand what's being said. If you want to be making people laugh, you can create this sort of break with order, and they no longer have to actually exert that effort. Now this is a very interesting and, oh sorry, careful with that. This is a really interesting idea, but unfortunately it's not technically true. Freud is working from a 19th century understanding of physiology, which is not actually how our energy works. You don't need laughter to diffuse that energy, and that means that while Freud's philosophy can actually be very helpful in helping us think things through, we can't just take it as written. All right, final model, incongruity theory. And this is probably the best model we've got, but as I talk about it, you may see that it's not a 100% satisfactory explanation of why we laugh. The basic idea is that we laugh at the unexpected. And that's not in itself an adequate explanation, because if I scare you or I surprise you, that doesn't necessarily make you laugh. So Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, argues that we laugh when the unexpected makes a new pattern. We're given a new pattern to replace the existing pattern. So the idea is that incongruity humor comes out of our desire for order. We as human beings want the world to make sense. Humorists have to first establish a pattern and then break it in a way that replaces it with a new pattern. All right, so humor and empathy. Now we've got two of my keywords at once. A lot of people think that humor and empathy can't coexist. Obviously, superiority humor and empathy really don't play well together. Henri Bergson, that French philosopher again, argues that humor comes from a kind of anesthesia of the heart. You can't feel anything when you're laughing at someone. Edith Stein, who's one of my favorite philosophers of empathy, actually says that we frequently experience, oops, I'm disconnected. Right, and I had my picture of Stein too. That we experience laughter from empathy, but not empathy with the object, but empathy with fellow laughers. One of her prime examples, and this is, I think is a very useful one because it challenges us to think through the sort of current cultural idea that empathy is fundamentally ethical. One of her arguments is that you might empathically learn anti-Semitism from your family. And I would point out that she was writing this in Germany in 1912 as her doctoral dissertation under Husserl, and she was eventually murdered by the Nazis. So this is the idea of empathically learning anti-Semitism is one which is very alive for this person, right? So far less common is the idea of empathizing with the object of your laughter, empathizing with whatever it is that's making you laugh. Humor and community. Plato argues that humor undermines authority and that therefore it undermines community. Plato's view of community is one that depends on a certain amount of stable authority. The guardians of the republic are to be chosen from people who don't laugh very much so that they won't undercut their own ability to maintain order. Bergson argues that laughter can promote community. There's a Freemasonry of laughter in which fellow laughers are sharing communal bonds. This is in opposition to the laughed at, and in fact, according to Bergson, laughter's social function is to kind of enforce our following of the rules so that you learn the rules in order to avoid being laughed at, and that's the whole point. This is basically the Mean Girls model of communal laughter. The people who laugh are a community, and they're excluding the people who are laughed at. Once again, not maybe the friendliest model of laughter. So, are these models adequate? And anytime an academic asks a question like that, you know perfectly well that the answer is going to be no, obviously not. So lots of humor definitely is superiority-based. Racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic humor is pervasive worldwide. So I'm not arguing it doesn't exist, because that would be objectively wrong. And people definitely do bond over their laughter at others, that happens. But human experience is really broad. Any individual human being's experience is very broad. You yourself have laughed at many things over the course of your life, or if you haven't, talk to me, there's help for that. So none of these examples really explains why we laugh at a pun satisfactorily. Or at least why your dad laughs at a pun if you don't. Why do we laugh at a cat video on YouTube? One of my sort of examples is the image of the cat batting at the doorknob, trying to open the door, and of course it can't. And I could be laughing because, haha, I am superior, I have thumbs, and I can open a doorknob, but that's a pretty lame reason to laugh at the cat. And I tend more to identify with, oh, that's just like that feeling of frustration I had the other day at work when I was trying to achieve something that I couldn't manage. So it's a laughter of identification, not a laughter of objectification. And then this idea of laughing at shared experience. When the comedian up on stage doing stand-up says, "Am I right, ladies?" and all the women in the audience go, "Oh, ha, ha, yes, he's right." That moment is not one of necessarily of superiority. It doesn't have to be, "Am I right, ladies, that men are terrible in the following 6 ways?" It can be instead, here's this shared experience you didn't realize anyone else even knew about, which we're all bonding over. So, humor, empathy, and community, how do those interact? And how do they interact in poetry? My fundamental argument is that American poets of the last 100 years or so, and I've picked that boundary somewhat arbitrarily, but also because I see this as a real through line in this particular group of writers. I don't mean that people in other countries and other cultures aren't doing it, merely that it's a very visible through line to me in this particular set of people. That American poets over the last 100 years or so are extremely interested in the ways that humor can broaden and narrow and redefine our sense of community. These communities can include, but are not limited to, local social communities like, hey, here are a lot of people in one room together, very kindly listening to me talk. We are a community, it's awesome. Literary history, who are my, as a poet, poetic ancestors? Whose work have I been reading? Whose work am I rebelling against? Who am I kind of indebted to, and what do I owe them, even if they've been dead for 200 years? The literary present, who are my peers? Poets are really big on ranking themselves against each other. Who are the great poets that I'm kind of competing with? Who am I confident I'm better than? I don't mean you have to do that to be a poet, just that they seem to spend a lot of time worrying about it, including on Twitter right now. And of course, because we're talking about the 20th century, real world politics, national identity, racial groups. We're talking about people who are living through major political upheavals where your sense of what your community is can have life or death stakes. So I want to set up some of those stakes by looking at two of the main poets that I use to set up my argument in my book, and then I'm going to move on to talk about one living poet for the rest of my time. First, W.H. Auden, who basically argues that superiority humor is not an ethically viable mode, especially if your superiority humor actually costs somebody something. A situation in which the actor really suffers can only be found comic by children who see only the situation and are unaware of the suffering, or by human swine, he says. So that's a really strong stand. You cannot laugh at someone else if they are actually suffering, or else you are a terrible, terrible person, is his position. So he's ruling out superiority humor entirely, which is a pretty gutsy thing to do for someone who writes a lot of intentionally comic poetry. I also want to just quickly gesture towards his idea of poetic community. In his 1937 poem, Letter to Lord Byron, he writes, "Parnassus, after all, is not a mountain reserved for A1 climbers such as you. It's got its parks, it's got its public fountain. The most I ask is leave to share a pew with Bradford or with Cottam. That will do." And so he's talking to Byron, the great long-dead romantic poet, but also name-checking these sort of minor poets who, like him, were gay men associated with Oxford, whom most of us in this room have probably not read because they were popular poets of their day. This is really disingenuous of Auden, who has said from early in his life, I mean to be a great poet, but he's willing to take the position that hanging out in a pew instead of at the top of a mountain, inside a communal church instead of up on the cliff heights, is somehow an adequate participation in poetic life in the poetic community. So he's taking that stand not because he's not ambitious as a poet, but because he's got a vision of community that he really cares about. Quickly, here's Marion Moore cosplaying George Washington, as she genuinely actually did. And I just want to quickly read her line, "Only wood weasels shall associate with me." This is where the skunks on the cover come from. Wood weasel is the term invented by her friend Hildegard Watson for a skunk, and she's got a poem called The Wood Weasel, in which she's basically saying what matters about skunks is not their smellingness, which she doesn't mention at all in the poem, but instead their playfulness. And she makes this argument that play is the defining feature of friendship. All right, so with all that set up, I'm finally going to come to Cathy Park Hong. She's a Korean-American poet. She's active now. You can follow her on Twitter. She's written 3 books of poetry and one spectacular memoir/volume of cultural critique. I'm going to be talking about her second book, Dance Dance Revolution. Dance Dance Revolution is it's a book of poems that follows a narrative. So it's not a novel in verse, it's a series of poems, but you have to read it from beginning to end in order or you're not going to get the narrative or understand what's going on. The main character, Sujin, is a former leader of the student uprising in Gwangju in Korea, which was against an authoritarian government. That's in her distant past, but the book itself is set in a fictional country called the Desert, which is an amalgam of Dubai and Las Vegas. They're these sort of artificially created desert cities, which are designed to be a playground for the rich, where you can get anything you like so long as you're willing to pay for it, and that anything you like is provided by the local population, who live very, very different lives from these rich paying hotel guests. Sujin has abandoned her name and is now known as the Guide, and what she's a guide to is the St. Petersburg Hotel. The bulk of the book, not all of it, but almost all of it, is written in a language called Desert Creole, which Han has made up for the purposes of the book. And it's an amalgam of Latin, Spanish, Korean, and dozens of English dialects, including the kind of American English I'm speaking now, but also Middle English, Anglo-Indian from the Indian colonial period, and a bunch of others. And if you're interested in dialects of English, this is a fabulous book to hang out in. So I want to spend a few minutes with the opening poem of the book, which when you first look at it is a little daunting. You might look at it and think, I don't recognize all these words, right? This is going to be hard. And one of the things that I want to point out is that the playfulness of Hong's work actually is coming out in part of this double exposure of unfamiliarity, which then resolves into familiarity. So the guide is meeting another character, the historian, she's called, at the airport, and says, "Opal, O opus, behold neon hibiscus bloom beacons, tan lotion Tanya billboard, she your lucent Virgil, den eyes take over as talkie Virgil. Want some tea, some pelahu? Mine vocation, your vacation." So what's happening here is we're getting an intensive introduction to Desert Creole. You realize you've been dropped in it and you're gonna have to figure it out as you go. But it also turns out, one, you're not lost, you've got a guide, you've got someone who's gonna help you. And two, you actually already know all these words. There is tan lotion Tanya on a billboard, and you know exactly what that looks like. That's a lady in a bikini trying to sell us sunscreen. And you know just what she looks like, because we know what those billboards look like. And so she's our Virgil, and Virgil, of course, is a reference to the Latin poet, who is not just a poet in his own right, although that's plenty, but he's also Dante's guide through the underworld in the Inferno. And so we've got a Virgil here, which is a vision of, I want to say, like the epitome of capitalist advertising, who's going to lead us through the difficulties of the desert. And at the same time, we've got the guide, me, your talkie Virgil. So she too is taking on this role, not just of navigating, but of navigating in a poetic lineage, which is making meaning for us and making meaning in the transcendent realm. Virgil is leading Dante through hell so he can get to purgatory, so that he can get to heaven and get to both God and his dead girlfriend. That final line, mine vocation, your vacation, I also want to sort of do a little reading of here. Vacation, we all know what vacation is, right? We just had spring break, that was nice. It's a time when you don't have as many obligations, right? And it comes from the same root as the word vacate. A true vacation is one that is time that is empty, or where the buildings that you're supposed to be in when you're working are empty. And so it's your vacation here is a time of emptiness. That sounds, kind of like tan lotion Tanya there. That's not deep. But mine vocation, my vocation, a vocation, that's your calling, from Latin vocare. And that's appropriately used for example, the calling of a priest. So we're getting this mishmash of the utterly empty and the most profound. Now, is that parody or is it fusion? And that gets to be a really interesting question over the course of the book. So each hotel in the desert is the microcosm of any city. Again, here, I just want to look at that word for a minute. It's a microcosm. It's like a shrinky-dink version. And we've seen this in Las Vegas, right? The Paris Hotel, the Venice Hotel. But that mic there, of course, also is a shout-out to McDonald's. So it's not just a shrinky-dink version. It really is like the reductio ad absurdum, the made to sell fast and cheap, not a real microcosm containing the sort of complexity and depth of a place, but the cheapest available, lowest common denominator version. Apologies to anyone who loves McDonald's food. I worked there when I was in college. You never get over that. And so in keeping with that, here is the guide's description of the bathroom. The washrooms of St. Petersburg. Die buttons and toilet manifold, pequeño es mungbeans, one for concierge if you suffer in bellyache, not a squirt's fountain of water to wash your besmirched hole after satis, one that will pipe in Wagner disco, din parfume to fume the awful air. So there's a lot going on there, right? I told you, fart jokes are in my index. Here we're imagining this kind of high-flown, enthusiastic description of a toilet, and okay, it sounds like a pretty fancy toilet, but it's still pretty gross. And some of that grossness is obvious, perfume to fume the awful air. Some is maybe one layer in. Well, that word awful, on the one hand, is, wow, that smells awful, but also that word awful spelled with an O is a term that refers to the edible intestines of animals. And then also the idea that you're going to need to pipe in Wagner in order to cover the sounds of using the bathroom. Yeah, you are having stomach trouble. That's pretty awful. So we're getting this parodic praise of this kind of horrifying in context bathroom. But is it just parody? So the guide has been a major figure in the Kwangju uprising. She's been on the side of these democratic student protesters. More recently, in the desert, there's been a revolution called the Dance Revolution, which has been violently put down by the autocratic regime never named running the desert. The language Desert Creole, in addition to being highly creolized, is unstable and fluid and constantly changing from speaker to speaker and even from utterance to utterance. We're told that nobody's accent stays the same from one day to the next, depending on who they've been talking to. So this playful language, it's not just parodying, it's reconfiguring literary tradition. The guide is our talkie Virgil, she's leading us through. That's a claim of Virgil's identity, not just a sort of a mockery thereof. And at the same time, we're rejecting the ideals of romantic poetry. The guide talks about a past visitor who's been looking for a melodious plot of beechen green, which is a line from Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. And as she points out, if you're in a desert, try, nary, there isn't any of that around here. So the romantic ideal of the poet isn't going to cut any ice here. And we see this sort of come to a head in The Auctioneer's Woo, which is a poem which describes the auction of a phrase. Officials in the desert commodify language, whereas desert Creole escapes commodification. And so this poem describes the sale of the phrase, "May I have this dance?" Somebody is going to own the rights to this phrase. Han wrote this poem before NFTs were a thing, but now NFTs do a really good job for me of explaining what's going on here, so I don't have to. The phrase is described as attractive to anybody who has a fetish for yore. So if we are nostalgic for sort of our vision of a Jane Austen romance, with all of the kind of repression and pretense that sex isn't happening and stuff like that that goes along with that, and I'm not, by the way, saying that Jane Austen is pretending that. I'm saying that the image is pretending that. So somebody's going to buy this phrase out of this kind of yearning for this allegedly simpler time, when one might collect, for example, a lock of Anglophene hair as keepsake. Now, on the one hand, this is this very sort of chaste idea of if you love someone, you might give them a lock of your hair, how romantic. But I see a few people who took my Brit Lit 2 survey. You know that this is actually a vexed question all the way back to when it was a more common practice. Because, for example, that idea of taking a lock of hair from someone might remind us of Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, where a guy snips off his ex-girlfriend's hair to take it just to be a jerk. It might also remind us of Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, in which giving a lock of your hair to someone voluntarily turns out to be basically selling your soul. Don't do that. If the goblins ask you for your hair, you say no. And at the same time, Park is, I think, pointing out sort of the racialized aspects of this fetish for yore, that Anglophene hair. That's not just anybody's hair, that's particularly very English hair that we're being asked to want. So the auction is an attempt to control language and in the process also to control both beauty and human interactions, how people behave to each other. But, of course, we're going to get away. In the last lines of this book, the guide says farewell to the historian who she's been guiding. If the world is our disco ball, might I have dim dance? So that phrase, may I have this dance, has been reconfigured into Desert Creole. It's been translated not very distantly, of course we can recognize it, but it's become, might I have dim dance. And that word dim, the guide uses throughout the book in place of this. But her use of it, I think, is in part highly motivated. Do come in, it's okay. Highly motivated by this final line. Yeah, go behind me because I've got a tripwire. So in which the dance itself becomes liberated from the constraints of tight observation. It's dim. It's not highly prescribed. Dance and language, by their very nature, are both choreographed and improvised. They're both at once. The book itself is not a machism, it's not a reduction of what it's talking about. Instead, the puns and playful references and parodies are multipliers instead of dividers. The humor and the wordplay that Hong is using here preserve our freedom of thought. The revolution is called the Dance Dance Revolution because the revolution itself is the dance. All right, so Hong is the example I've worked through with you of this, others do it too, of how humor can force us to re-examine what it is we actually think that we know. Laughter and funniness can reveal the discontinuities and the inconsistencies and the gaps in our understanding of the world. These revelations can really challenge us to think in revolutionary ways. We have to ask ourselves, what counts as high culture? Virgil, what counts as low culture? Tan Lotion, Tanya, what counts as funny and why? And most importantly, who has the authority to determine what those categories actually are? Poets' laughter, of course, can redraw familiar lines. There's a reason I've got Ezra Pound, who was convicted of treason for fascism, as one of the chapters of my book. He is all about laughter, defining his community on his terms. But poets' laughter can also be fundamentally anti-authoritarian and democratizing. Hong joins Auden and Moore and other poets that I talk about in treating humor as a way to achieve meaningful intersubjective insight. If you are laughing with me, that means we can understand each other. Now, empathy has limits, particularly in moments of crisis. You can empathically feel unjust or cruel emotions. And many of the poets that I'm writing about here also will talk about that. There's a spectacular Lucille Clifton poem that I'm not going to talk about right now, but I really want to, which is all about how belief in empathic laughter can mislead you into becoming more cruel. This isn't a perfect recipe, but at the same time, laughter can make us reassess the boundaries between high and low, between self and other, and thereby offer us a new way to understand and demarcate our own communities, whether those communities are social or poetic. Thank you so much. And as I said, copies available for sale. You can see me or Cam if you want a copy, and I will still love you if you don't.